to how man sees things. Listen, Goliath had all the things that we would normally be impressed with, and he had this intimidating stature. But David saw as God saw, and he was neither impressed nor intimidated by Goliath. Because no matter how big the giant might be, God is greater. And no matter how powerful he might be, God is all powerful. So let's look at this tonight. Let's look first of all at the challenge to the living God. The challenge to the living God. Now, as I've already said, 1 Samuel 17 is not just a story about a young man fighting a grown giant. It's a story about the conflict of the ages. It's Satan against God, good against evil. It's a story about a challenge to the living God by Satan and his forces of evil. And it all takes place in a moment of time in the valley of Elah. Let's look at the scene of the challenge. Picture this scene. Look at chapter 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and they were gathered together at Shochoh, which belonged to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched in the valley of Elah, and the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. So the valley of Elah was not a narrow ravine, but more like a vast canyon, maybe a mile wide. And at the bottom of the canyon between the slopes was a brook where David found the 5 smooth stones for his sling. On one side was a great slope, a half a mile or so in size. On the other side was another slope about the same size. On one slope were the armies of the Israelites, and on the other the armies of the Philistines. Look at the size of the challenge next. Look at verses 4 through 7. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was about 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. So the size of the challenge is evident. It's the size of Goliath. He was from Gath, a place where Moses sent the spies to check out the promised land and reported seeing giants. We see that in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. And these are the spies reporting back to Joshua, and they say, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come out of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, so we were in their sight. Now look how every verse of Scripture is minutely accurate and should strengthen our faith in the Word of God. Because we read in Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 and 22, and at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains, from Hebron to Debir and Anab, and from the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities, and there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel only. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. And here we see that Goliath belonged to Gath in verse 4. So we see with the mouth of 3 witnesses, Moses, Joshua, and Samuel, how God verifies his word in every detail. And that's why we can trust his word. Now back to the size of Goliath. He was 6 cubits in a span, or about 9 feet, 9 inches tall. You know, the NBA would love him, wouldn't they? I mean, he would be about 2 feet taller than the tallest basketball player. I probably could have used a giant this week in my fantasy team. But anyway. But he wasn't skinny like many of the taller ones are, though. All right, Goliath was strong and wide. All right, he was huge, and he probably weighed between 400 and 500 pounds. And he had a coat of mail. And this was a heavy canvas-like undergarment that were interlaced with overlapping ringlets of bronze. And his coat of mail went from the shoulder to the knee, covering and protecting against the enemy's weapons. And body armor of such material and size weighed about 5,000 shekels of bronze, or maybe 175 to 250 pounds. And not only that, he had a brass helmet. brass leg covers, a coat of mail that weighed about 250 pounds, and a spear with a shaft like a telephone pole, with a point weighing between 15 and 20 pounds. Think about that. A spearhead, 15 to 20 pounds. It's bigger than a bowling ball, or heavier than a bowling ball anyway. And in front of Goliath was a shield bearer who was there to protect Goliath from the arrows that might be shot at him. And the shield was about the size of a full-grown man. So in addition to his body armor, Goliath had this fellow running in front of him carrying a man-sized shield as double protection. So David was facing a huge mammoth challenge. And imagine for a minute this imposing picture in your mind. Imagine how frightening it would be to take on a giant this size protected by an armor bearer. Listen, the odds were stacked against anyone foolish enough to face him in battle. And the next thing we see is the shout of the challenge. Look at verses 8 through 10. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then ye shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Now, this is one of the few times in history that two nations decided to settle their battle in this way. Instead of wiping out the Israelites and losing all their potential slaves, the Philistines wanted to settle the fight economically. One man would represent one side, and the other man would represent the other side. And they'd fight it out between themselves, and the nation whose man won would get the victory. And then we see the seriousness of the challenge in verse 16. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. So Goliath shouted for Israel to send out a man to fight him. And nobody wanted to go out there to take up the challenge. And Goliath didn't issue this challenge and then leave. No, this challenge went on for 40 days. Every morning and every evening for over a month, he would march out there, flaunt his size and his strength, just daring anyone to take him on. But no one volunteered. In fact, the giant's challenge began to wear on the soldiers of Israel. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So here was a pagan causing the armies of God to stand in powerless fear. And you know what? We all feel that way sometimes, don't we? All right, the battles that we face can feel insurmountable, beyond our capacity to stand up and fight. So let's apply this to the giants we face. For example, take the giants of worry and fear. All right, they don't come once. They come morning and evening, day after day, relentlessly trying to intimidate us. And isn't that when we worry the most? In the morning when we first get up, and at night when we lay our heads on our pillow? And they may come in the form of a person or a pressure or a worry. All right, some fear that hammers on your heart every morning and every night. And it wears you down day after day after day, yelling at you across the ravine in your own personal valley. Now, not very many things are more persistent and intimidating than our fears and worries, especially when we face them in our own strength. And that's exactly the situation that faced the Israelites. All right, they were confronted with a challenge that they didn't have an answer for. So that's the challenge to the living God. The next thing we see is the champion of the living God. The champion of the living God. Now, it would take a champion to face the challenge of Goliath. And David had the heart of a champion. You know, it doesn't matter how old a person is, he or she can have the heart of a champion. And when we talk about champions for the Lord, we need to look no further than David to see the attributes that a champion possesses. And the first one is he was consistent in the routine things. He was consistent in the routine things. Look at verses 12 through 22. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judea, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him Abinadab, and the third Shemnah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and then these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their thousands, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. So the sun rose that morning just like every other morning, both for David and Goliath. All right? That's the way it often is in life. No warning. One day can change your world completely. Now, I'm sure Goliath didn't plan on dying that day. And I'm also sure that David didn't even consider that he would be a hero by the day's end. But they both happened. All right, but the truth is that the 41st morning of Goliath's challenge would be the last day of his life, and the first day of David's heroic life. And life is so unpredictable, isn't it? And we don't cherish life as we should. All right, we don't stop to think that this could be the last day of our lives, or even the lives of one of our loved ones. And if we did, we would be careful how we treated them. And Jesse sent David to the battle with food for his 3 sons. And notice this, God was directing all things so that his will would be accomplished. Listen, Jesse had how many sons? He had 8 sons, and only 3 of them had joined Saul's army. So 5 of them were at home. And yet the youngest, David, was the one that he sent. Even though Jesse didn't know it, God worked through him because he had a job for David to do. And nothing happens by chance in this world, all right? God knows everything, and God plans things the way he wants to. John 19:11 says, Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above. Now while his 3 brothers went to war, David was sent back to his sheep. All right, he had been called to play for Saul at times, but now with Saul busy with war plans, David was back in the field. Now remember, David had been anointed king, and he was waiting to take over the kingship of Israel. But we see here that he was willing to serve as a shepherd and part-time harpist for Saul. David didn't try to go ahead of God's schedule. He went back and did the menial task, and when he was asked to do an errand to bring food for his brothers, he obeyed. And then look at verse 20. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to fight, and shouted for the battle. So David got someone to keep his sheep before he went. Now you can imagine how excited it would have been for him to see the war. But he was responsible for the sheep, and he made sure that they were taken care of first. All right, David was consistent, and that's what made him a champion. And champions are willing to concentrate on the details that others don't notice. They're willing to follow the routine even when no one else is watching. And everyone wants to win, but not everyone is willing to take the time to prepare to win. And David wasn't afraid to prepare. He did the routine things carefully. And the next, we see he was challenged by the impossible things. Look at verses 23 and 24. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. So picture this. Picture this moment. David is standing there talking to his 3 brothers, when all of a sudden he hears this loud cry from across the ravine. And suddenly everyone around him is rushing to the rear and climbing into their tents. Now remember, David has never seen this giant of Gath or heard this challenge. And suddenly he's standing there alone as everyone else around him runs for cover. And he looks across the battlefield and he sees this giant of a guy encased in armor, shouting out threats and defiance and cursing the God of Israel. And that made David livid. No one talks that way about the God of Israel, he thought. So why is everybody running away? Now remember, this is the 41st day the Israelites have encountered Goliath. But this is the first time it's happened to David. And isn't it interesting how hindsight gives us a lot of insight? All right, have you ever faced a Goliath and then 3 days later you look back and say, man, I wish I'd have done such and such? And that's hindsight perspective. And it's usually infallible. And when you look back, you always know a better way. But at the time it happens, you kind of shoot from the hip, unless you're a David. David had the character to see the present as though he was seeing with hindsight. And he wasn't impressed, nor was he intimidated. What a wise young man. Look what he does in verses 25 through 27. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that has come up? Surely to defy Israel he has come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and take his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, so it shall be done to the man that killeth him. Well, David starts asking questions, and he finds out who this giant is and was told that the man who killed Goliath would be given riches in Saul's daughter's hands in marriage. See, the only reason Saul created this incentive was because he was a coward. All right, now remember, Saul was head and shoulders above the rest, and he was their king. So he's the one who should have been out to fight the giant. But Saul was afraid. Why? Because he was operating in the flesh, and he refused to trust God. So he had worked out a plan that hopefully would get somebody else out into the battle. And he promised the man who killed Goliath a reward of great riches. He promised his daughter's hand in marriage, and he promised to exempt the father's house from paying taxes. Well, I'm not sure that the daughter was much as a reward, and we'll see about that later. But a bride and riches, a perpetual tax exemption, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? But even that wasn't enough to get a volunteer. And also notice this. Look at Goliath's position this day as compared when he first challenged Israel. Now in verse 8, when he first challenged Israel, it says, choose you a man for you and let him come down to me. But verse 25 says, after 40 days, have you seen this man that is, these are the Israelites, or somebody saying in the Israelites, have you seen, speaking of Goliath, have you seen this man that has come up? So Goliath has crossed the ravine at the base of the valley, and he's coming up on Israel's side. You see, if you tolerate a Goliath, then he'll take over your territory. He'll move into your camp. He'll take the thoughts that you should have that should be on God, and he will put them on himself. He will keep you thinking of the giants in your life. And that's why you can't afford to tolerate giants. That's why you have to kill them. So David volunteers. And next we see he was committed in spite of ridicule. Now champions look at the impossible and say, we can do it. And then you know what happens? They're often targets for a lot of criticism. Look at verse 28. And Eliab, the eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and thy naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again in the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine, to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. Now remember, Eliab is the oldest son, a man of great stature and probably had some ability. All right, he was the first one to walk in front of Samuel the prophet as he was looking for the future king. And he probably thought as he was walking there that he would be the one that would be chosen for a king. Hey, maybe I can be a king now. Maybe I'll be chosen. But God wasn't choosing based on outward appearances. And David had a heart for God that Eliab didn't have. And he was rejected. And then he watched his little brother as he was anointed king. And that would be hard to take, wouldn't it? And it must have infuriated the older brother. And now young David was asking questions about this giant that Eliab was so afraid of. So he began criticizing his brother. He said to David, You know what? Why have you really come? In other words, he attacked David's motive. Look, David, why have you really shown up here? And then he asked a second question, which was designed to humiliate David. Hey, David, where did you leave that little handful of sheep? Just sort of twisting the knife. And then he gets downright ugly. I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart. You just came here for the excitement. You just want to see the battle. And there's also a possibility that the Hebrew text implies you have come down here to be seen in the battle. You want to be seen doing something. Now, at this point, the average person would probably have rolled up his sleeves and used all his energy to punch his brother's lights out rather than dealing with Goliath. But instead, David just ignores him, as if to say, hey, all I did was ask a question. Now let's go on to the important thing, that giant out there. And he just turns away. See, David knew who to fight and who to leave alone. He knew who the real enemy was. And listen, we need to choose our battles wisely. All right? If you don't watch it, all of your battles will be fought among fellow members of the family of God. You know, we spend so much time fighting each other as Christians, and that's so sad. But it's true many times. We complain about this, we grumble about that, and all the while Satan is laughing his head off at us. And Satan, the real enemy of our souls, roams around in our territory, winning victory after victory. And now the scene changes from Eliab to David, and David to Saul and David. Now remember our verse? Man is impressed with the externals. He doesn't see the heart. God is different. He doesn't judge by the appearance or intelligence. And King Saul hadn't learned this lesson. So he looked at David and said, You don't have the size for it. You're just a kid. Look over there at that giant. And I can imagine David blinking and saying, What giant? The only giant in my life is God. And that's a dwarf over there. That's a dwarf there, Saul. God's not impressed with the externals. He looks on the heart. God is omnipotent. And if he's on my side, omnipotence can't lose. And then David then describes to Saul how in the past God proved himself faithful when David slew a bear and a lion, which means that he was courageous in the Lord. Look at verses 34 through 37. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. And David said, Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. You know, many times when we face our giants, we forget that we ought to remember. We forget what we ought to remember, and remember what we ought to forget. We remember our defeats, and we forget our victories. And most of us can remember the details of our failures, but we can't remember the remarkable victories that God has pulled off in our past. But David didn't remember the defeats. He remembered the lion and the bear. He remembered the victory that God had given him, and so he was confident that God would do it again. He says, you know why I can fight Goliath, Saul? Because the same God who gave me power over a lion and a bear will give me power over this Goliath. It is God who will empower me. So just let me at him. Well, that lets Saul off the hook, right? So he says, go, and the Lord be with thee. And isn't it something how people can talk a spiritual talk even though their lives are empty of any power and blessings of the Lord? They know the right words to use, all the pious-sounding sayings. But Saul sure did. The Lord be with thee. He was way far away from the Lord. And then we next see that David was confident in the Spirit. Verses 38 and 39. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass on his head. Also he armored him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he swayed to go, for he had to prove it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off of him. Saul says to David, well, we have to fix you up for battle. Now imagine this for a moment. Now you can't tell me that the Bible doesn't have humor in it, okay? Because it says that Saul clothed David with his garments. Now here's Saul. He's a 52 long, and David's a 36 regular. And so Saul drags in this heavy armor and says, hey, put this on, David. And he hands David his sword, and it's so big that he can't even hold the thing. And he drops this oversized helmet onto his head, clunk. And then he wraps his coat of mail around David. And David says, Saul, I can't fight with this stuff on. I can't even walk with it. And I'm sure I haven't tested it in battle. So David takes it off. And we learn from this is that what works for one person won't necessarily work for someone else. All right, we're always trying to put our armor on someone else or put someone else's armor on ourselves. But that's not the way to do battle. Listen, God can use us as we are. We don't need to try to be someone else. All right, God uses unique people for unique tasks, and we're all different. So we see the challenge of the living God, we see the champion of the living God, and then next we see the conquest by the living God. The conquest by the living God. Now the end of the story is exciting because it shows that God's more powerful than any man or any man-made weapon. And the end of the story reveals triumph of good and the conquest of the living God. Let's look at the instruments of David, verse 40. And he took his staff in his hands and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Now all David chose to take with him were a staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones which he had put in his shepherd's bag. And rather than relying on armor and shields, David was relying on God. And God magnifies his name when we are weak. All right, we don't have to be beautiful or brilliant or have all the answers to be blessed by God. He honors our faith. All he asks us to do is trust him and that we stand before him in integrity and faith. And then he'll win the battle. And God is waiting for us to trust him so that he can empower us to battle our giants. Now remember, Goliath is still a giant. He's still an opposing figure, and the odds are against David. All right, there wasn't a guy in the Philistine camp, or probably in the Israel camp for that matter, who would have bet on David. But David didn't need their backing. He only needed God. After picking up the stones, he approaches the gigantic Philistine warrior. And the shepherd boy made the giant laugh. What a joke. The insult to God. Look at verses 41 and 42. And the Philistine came on and drew near to David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Now imagine what Goliath must have thought. All right, he's been coming into that valley for 40 days, waiting for someone brave enough to meet him in battle. And all he sees is his terrified soldiers. And then on this day, he sees a boy with no armor or no weapons, no shield bearer, no armor bearer. So he says in verses 43 and 44, and the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field." All right? Here we see the intimidation of the giant. Verses 45 and 40 through 47. Then said David to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thy head from thee, and I will give thy carcass to the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So this was the moment of truth. David has just infuriated the biggest bully on the block. And if God isn't on David's side, what's going to happen? David's a dead man. Not only that, the Lord had made the promise to redeem mankind through David's line. So if David dies, the promised redemption is over. David intimidated Goliath. He was not intimidated by Goliath. All right, just imagine it. David stood before this massive creature unintimidated. Intimidation. All right, that's our major battle when we face giants, isn't it? When they intimidate us, we get tongue-tied. Our thoughts get confused. We forget how to pray. We focus on the odds against us. We forget who we represent, and we stand there with our knees knocking. And I wonder what God must think when all the while he has promised to take care of us. My power is available, he says. There's no one on earth greater than me. Trust me. You trust me. His power is available to all of us. All we need to do is trust him. And David knew the battle was the Lord's. That's what he said. The battle is the Lord's. And that's where we get in trouble. We try to fight the battle in our own power, in our own way. We try to outsmart the enemy. We can't do it, but God can. And he's saying to us, do it my way and I'll honor you. Do it your way and you're doomed to fail. The battle is mine. And David lived by a very simple principle. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose. He didn't try to impress anybody in the army of the Israelites. He didn't try to impress his brothers. He didn't even try to impress God. He just ran out to meet Goliath. And David purposely intimidates Goliath, and by doing so, he sets himself up to win the battle. And that's where we see the impact of a champion, verses 48 and 49. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. Listen, Goliath got so mad at David's words that he rushed forward, not even bothering to put his helmet on. But David also raced forward, taking out a stone and hurling it into the forehead of the giant. And he fell on his face. And that big guy with his heavy armor must have made quite a noise going down. Probably shook the earth a little bit. And then verses 50 through 54. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out, and the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Shaaraim, and even Gath and to Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So David then cuts off his head. Now imagine what both sides must have thought. I bet they couldn't believe their eyes when they saw this. And the Israelites must have thought, did we just see what we saw? And the Philistines must be saying, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. So think about the lessons of the story. God won the victory with a teenager, a sling, a stone, and a borrowed sword. And he loves to use foolish things to confound the wise. And we all face giants every day. We have the challenge of trying to live as Christians in a lost world. And like David, we need to be willing to confront our problems. And Saul wouldn't do that. He stood around for 40 days trying to pass his problem off to somebody else. Saul was a coward. He refused to walk with God. But David was courageous, making sure to rely on the Lord. And we need to confront our problems with the courage of the Lord. And one more thing that we can learn from this story is to cherish our trophies. And I don't mean that we need to live in the past, but we shouldn't forget our victories either. And I wonder if maybe David kept those trophies for the rest of his life. Who knows? Maybe after he became king, he had a weapon room with a trophy case where he kept the memories of God's past victories in his life. And winning victories is extremely significant. Remember them. So where do you keep your memories? Do you quickly pass over the victories? Break that habit. God doesn't waste victories. And when he pulls something off only that he can do, he says to us, now don't you forget that. In Old Testament times, God had his people pile up a huge stack of stones as reminders of winning various victories on their behalf. And those stones of remembrance were to remain there for all to see and remember. And our trophies remind us that we are winners and gives us encouragement to keep facing our challenges. And quickly we learn at least 4 lessons from the significant battle between David and Goliath. The first one is facing giants is an intimidating experience. Facing giants is an intimidating experience. All right, we can look back at David's bravery and victory with perfect hindsight and a safe distance of 2,000 or so years. But humanly speaking, imagine what it must have felt like to face the intimidating presence of that brute with the eyes of faith. Yet David said, my God is greater than he. And then secondly, doing battle is a lonely experience. Doing battle is a lonely experience. No one else can fight it for you. All right? Your Goliath is your Goliath. Someone else might say, don't worry about that. But to you, it's your Goliath. And nobody else can battle him for you. Not even a counselor or a pastor. Not even a spouse, a parent, or a friend. And it's lonely. But it enables you to grow up. All right? It's on the lonely battlefield that you learn to trust God. And then thirdly, trusting God is a stabilizing experience. Trusting God is a stabilizing experience. David brought down Goliath with the first stone. His aim was true and he didn't miss the mark. And we can't know for sure, but from every indication, he didn't have the jitters when he went into battle. He was stabilized by his trust in God. And if you try to tackle the giant in the flesh, then you cannot get it done. You'll lose. But when you have spent significant time on your knees, it's remarkable how stable you can be. And then fourthly, winning victories is a memorable experience. Winning victories is a memorable experience. Again, we need to remember the victories of our past. All right, we're to pass on our lion and bear victories, our own Goliath victories. Now, I don't know what's intimidating you today. I don't know what giant's intimidating you. It might relate to your job, your roommate, your school. Maybe it's a person, a lawsuit, unemployment, a disaster, maybe even your own partner in life. Maybe it's some fear that's lurking around every corner, sucking your energy and draining your faith. And God's saying to you right now, all I ask of you is 5 smooth stones and a sling of faith, and I'll take it from there. You don't have to wear somebody else's armor. You just trust me, and I'll strip you down to nothing but faith, and then I'll accomplish a victory where I'll get the glory. But as for you, you trust me. Now, maybe you don't know what lies across the valley. Maybe you can't get a handle on what that giant is, but it's there, haunting you. That uncertainty alone is a giant. But look at the worry in comparison to the Lord God himself and say by faith, the battle is yours, Lord. It's your battle. I lean on you. I give you all my weapons, all my skills, and I stand before you trusting you. And it's God's love for us that causes him to bring us to an end of our own strength. He sees our need to